The last free Apache warrior in the world was selling buttons from his shirt at a train station. He charged 25 cents for each one. When the train pulled away, he sewed on new buttons to sell at the next stop. This man had forced a quarter of the United States Army to pursue him for years through the most hostile desert on the American continent. He was the warrior that Mexican soldiers called out to by name as they died in combat, invoking a saint to protect them from him. He was the last Native American leader to formally surrender to the United States, and he was on a train selling buttons. What you're going to see today is the story no one tells about the end of Geronimo. Not the warrior you know, the man who came after the warrior, what they did to him, what he did to survive, the promises they broke. The question he asked with tears on his cheeks, that the President of the United States answered in 2 sentences, and the last words he spoke before dying in February of 1909. When you finish this video, you'll understand that Geronimo's story didn't end in 1886 when he surrendered. It ended much later, and in a way no one would have asked of him. To understand what happened at the end, you first have to understand the trap they built at the beginning. In 1876, the United States government made a decision that would change everything. It ordered all Apache living in Arizona and southwestern New Mexico to be relocated to a single reservation in central Arizona. It was called San Carlos. The soldiers who administered it gave it the nickname that remained in the historical record, Hell's 40 Acres. The San Carlos Apache Reservation portal, documented on Wikipedia with 19th century primary sources, describes the conditions: arid, rocky land, completely unfit for agriculture, with diseases like smallpox and malaria constantly circulating among the crowded population. Government agents routinely embezzled the funds meant to feed the Apache. American traders charged exploitative prices. There wasn't enough food. The Indian Reservation portal documents the contrast with devastating clarity. For a warrior like Geronimo, who valued freedom above all else, San Carlos was a cage. Geronimo didn't take long to respond. In 1876, he escaped for the first time. The army pursued him and he was captured in 1877, returning to San Carlos in chains. In September 1881, he escaped again, this time toward the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico with 70 warriors. In May 1885, he led the largest and final breakout. 135 people, warriors, women and children, vanished into the desert night. Each escape followed the same pattern. The Apache abandoned the reservation, crossed Arizona and New Mexico into Mexico, established a camp in the Sierra Madre where the American army couldn't follow them, and from there launched raids on both sides of the border. The third and final breakout of 1885 triggered what Wikipedia documents as the most costly military campaign of the Apache Wars. General Nelson Miles deployed 5,000 soldiers and 500 Apache scouts to pursue Geronimo and his remaining 36 people, 5,000 against 36. For 16 months they couldn't catch them. How was that possible? To understand why 5,000 soldiers couldn't catch 36 people for over a year, you have to understand something about Geronimo that the textbooks don't teach. Geronimo was not just a warrior. He was a shaman, a medicine man.
Get that rope around
Geronimo's
him now.
autobiography,
It's not going anywhere.
dictated to S.M. Barrett and published in 1906, records something he himself narrated without any doubt. Months after the Janos massacre of 1851, which had killed his mother, his wife, and his 3 children, Geronimo went alone into the mountains. There he heard a voice that spoke his name 4 times, the Apache's sacred number, and then said, "No gun can ever kill you. I will take the bullets from the guns of the Mexicans, so they will have nothing but powder, and I will guide your arrows." Geronimo believed that for the rest of his life, and what the historical record documents is extraordinarily difficult to explain. HistoryNet, in its analysis of Geronimo as a shaman, documents that throughout decades of combat, he was never seriously wounded by a bullet. The artist Elbridge Eyre Burbank, who went to paint him in Alabama in 1893, was astonished by the number of scars on his body, evidence of countless violent encounters.
The entire campaign.
But no bullet had
We
killed
strike
him.
here at dawn,
Whether
regardless
this
of the
was
resistance.
supernatural protection, exceptional physical resilience, or the skill of an extraordinary warrior at avoiding direct fire, is something history cannot resolve. What the historical documentation does establish is the psychological effect on his followers. His own warriors believed he had supernatural powers. A man who believes his leader is invulnerable fights in a fundamentally different way than a man who believes he can die. And for the army pursuing them, the effect was the opposite. That same myth generated a fear that amplified Geronimo's tactical capability far beyond his actual numbers. The historian at Warfare History Network quotes Geronimo's cousin Jason Betzines, who knew him closely. He never forgot what Sonora had done to his family, and he carried that bitterness in his heart throughout his entire life.
But the wind remembers the trails we
He
walked
didn't fight
across
for
these
politics.
plains.
He didn't fight for territory. He fought because it was the only thing he had left after Janos. In the summer of 1886, even the most extraordinary resistance reached its limit. Geronimo's group was exhausted. The women and children couldn't go on. The promises that General Miles sent them through intermediaries were tempting. If they surrendered, they would go to Florida. They would be with their families, and after a time they could return to Arizona. The Legends of America portal documents the final moment with precision. On September 4th, 1886, at Skeleton Canyon in Arizona, Geronimo sat down across from General Nelson Miles. "This is the 4th time I have surrendered," he said, "and I think it is the last." He signed the surrender. And the promise to return to Arizona was broken the moment the train left the station. Hold on to that, because what comes next is not the end of Geronimo's story. It's the beginning of something completely different, something no one had told him was coming. The train carrying Geronimo and his followers went first to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, then to Fort Pickens in Pensacola, Florida. Geronimo's family, his wife and children, were sent to Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida, 300 miles away. They wouldn't see each other until 1888. In Florida, the Apache began to die, not from combat, from disease. Wikipedia documents the numbers. In Alabama, where they were transferred in 1888 to be reunited with their families, a quarter of the entire Chiricahua population died of tuberculosis, 1 in 4. The Washington Post of the era, quoted by Wikipedia, described the situation with a phrase that remained in the archives. The Apache were dying like flies in the time of the frost. Geronimo in prison watched his people die around him, not from bullets, from humidity, from disease, from overcrowding. And the United States government saw an opportunity in all of this. Florida businessmen convinced military authorities that Geronimo was a tourist attraction. Hundreds of visitors a day entered the fort to see the bloodthirsty Indian in his cell. Geronimo sold autographs. He posed for photographs. The collector portal documents that at the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha in 1898, he was officially labeled the Apache Terror and was part of what modern historians describe without euphemism as a human zoo. The most feared warrior of the American Southwest was turned into a spectacle. In 1894, Geronimo and 341 of the last Chiricahua prisoners of war were transferred to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. It wasn't Arizona. It wasn't the desert where he had been born and loved and lost everything. But it was land where they could farm. Geronimo was 65 years old. He became a farmer. He grew melons. He raised horses and bet on them. He played poker with his old Apache companions. He lived in a house with his daughter. And he understood that his fame
future of our
could become
people is on that
currency.
horizon.
The HistoryNet portal, in its analysis when Geronimo met Teddy Roosevelt, documents with almost comic and fully verified detail
And a
what
time
Geronimo
for hoping
did
the
before
morning
each
comes
trip. Before leaving Fort Sill to travel to Roosevelt's inauguration, an army officer gave him a check for $171 for his expenses. Geronimo took it to the bank, deposited $170, and left the house with only $1, confident he could earn his expenses at train stations along the way. This time, he didn't bother with buttons or hats. He simply scrawled his name on scraps of paper for 50 cents apiece. This was the man who in 1885 had eluded 5,000 soldiers for 16 months. Now he was signing his name on scraps of paper for tourists who paid 50 cents. And yet, at 75, he still had a plan. On March 4th, 1905, Geronimo rode on horseback down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., in the inaugural parade of President Theodore Roosevelt. He and 5 other indigenous chiefs led the parade. The crowd stood along the entire route. The Wikipedia portal documents that the stated intention of the event, according to several newspapers of the era, was to show Americans that they had buried the hatchet forever. The most feared Apache warrior, tamed and exhibited as a symbol of an era that had already passed. Geronimo had a different intention. Days after the parade, he met with Roosevelt at the White House. Smithsonian Magazine documents what happened with primary source detail, including the report from the New York Tribune of the era. Geronimo asked that he and his people be released from their status as prisoners of war and allowed to return to their homeland in Arizona. "Take the ropes from our hands," Geronimo said. The New York Tribune reported that at that moment, he had tears running down his bullet-scarred cheeks. Roosevelt responded through an interpreter. He told Geronimo that he had a bad heart. "You killed many of my people. You burned villages, and you were not a good Indian."
Immediately.
The president needed to wait and see how you and your people act on the reservation. HistoryNet documents the close of that meeting with a phrase from a Roosevelt aide that says everything. "The Great Father is very busy," they told Geronimo, leading Roosevelt away and encouraging the Apache to put his concerns in writing. The most powerful man in the Western world didn't have time for the most powerful man the American desert had ever produced. Geronimo returned to Fort Sill. That same year, S.M. Barrett, superintendent of schools in Lawton, Oklahoma, offered to publish Geronimo's autobiography. Geronimo accepted on one condition: he wanted half of the profits. The military commander at Fort Sill rejected the project.
Yes, it will be
He
a strong
told Barrett
harvest.
that Geronimo deserved to be hanged, not celebrated. Barrett appealed directly to Roosevelt. Roosevelt gave him permission. The army reviewed the manuscript and removed the parts it considered too critical of military actions. Geronimo's autobiography, Geronimo's Story of His Life, was published in 1906. He dedicated it to President Roosevelt with these words: "I am thankful that the President of the United States has given me permission to tell my story. I hope that he and those in authority under him will read my story and judge whether my people have been treated right." And he closed it with another request that was printed forever. "It is my land, my home, my father's land." That land was never returned to him. On February 11th, 1909, Geronimo fell from his horse while returning home in the dark. He lay on the cold ground all night. They found him the next morning, gravely ill. They took him to the hospital at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He died of pneumonia on February 17th, 1909. He was a prisoner of war. He had been one for 23 years. The collector portal documents his last recorded words. On his deathbed, Geronimo said he should never have surrendered. "I should never have surrendered." He was buried in the Apache cemetery at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, among the graves of other Chiricahua prisoners, thousands of miles from the Arizona mountains where he had been born. There is something else that almost no one mentions about the end of this story, and it's what makes everything that came before even more irresolvable. General George Crook, who pursued him for years, and who in many respects knew him better than any other army commander, left something on record that never fit the official narrative about Geronimo. Acuteness of senses, perfect physical condition, absolute knowledge of the territory, near absolute ability to preserve themselves from danger.
It's not for sale.
That was not a description of an enemy. It was a description of an extraordinary man. And the government that had pursued him for decades ended up exhibiting him at World's Fairs, parading him at presidential inaugurations, selling him as a symbol of a bygone era. All of that while keeping him a prisoner of war until the last day of his life. The question Geronimo asked through tears in 1905, "Let me return to my land," is the same question his descendants can still ask today. The Fort Sill Apache, direct heirs of Geronimo's people, have spent decades fighting legally for the remains of their ancestors to be returned to Apache territory. Geronimo's question was not left unanswered. It was left unresolved. A man sold buttons from his shirt at train stations. A man who had forced 5,000 soldiers to chase him through the Sonora Desert. A man who had cut his hair in the darkness of Llanos on a night in 1851 and had gotten back on his feet to build something new from the most absolute loss a human being can survive. Behind the name that Mexican soldiers screamed in their death throes, behind the warrior that the most powerful army in the world couldn't catch for decades, behind the figure at the World's Fair and the inaugural parade, there was a man who simply wanted to go home, and they wouldn't let him. If this video opened up something you didn't expect to find, there are more stories like this here. Not the characters that official history constructed, the real people who lived and died behind those names. The next story is already waiting for you.